It wasn't long ago that China was Starbucks' poster child of successful international expansion.
Thank you.
China was viewed as a fertile growth opportunity, just given the urbanization of the population, a growing middle class, as well as proclivity for Western brands.
We can build Starbucks stores in China as fast as we can for the rest of my life.
It's quite a bold claim that they have there. I'm assuming this shifts, and that's why we're watching this today. But at least from the tech side, my understanding was China was actually a pretty difficult market to enter into. I don't know if this is as true for more standard products like coffee or clothing or other things like that, but within the tech sector, it's pretty well known that like entering the Chinese market is very, very hard. This is something that some other companies like Tesla have had a lot of difficulty with in a more recent case. And so I'm actually a little surprised that they were very positive about Starbucks at some point in China. But it does make sense. There are going to be some brands or some types of products that are easier to make that transition across cultural differences.
And still have addressable market to gain in China.
From 2017 to 2020, Starbucks added about 3,200 stores in China. Revenue was hit hard by pandemic lockdowns in 2020. Despite China's strict zero-COVID policies, the company rebounded with explosive sales growth the following year. But sales have since stagnated. Between 2021 and 2024, revenue is down about $700 million, all while Starbucks added an additional 2,200 stores in the country.
That's actually pretty problematic. So they're increasing stores, but sales are keeping stagnant. That means basically the growth in stores is offsetting the decline in the per store purchase area. Or this could also mean that they're reaching like market saturation where the demand for Starbucks has been fully realized, and that maybe adding the new location just makes it more convenient for their customer base to go to one location versus another. Not necessarily that there's less demand, because obviously the number's still the same. But this is where if the number of Starbucks around you doubles or triples, you would still probably buy the same amount of Starbucks. You just might shift which store you go to. So that it could be one of those two things, but I'm sure they're going to elaborate more on that.
Emblematic of a market that's maturing, where you do have multiple entrants. In the US, of course, there's multiple strong coffee competitors. China didn't, necessarily have that 10 years ago, but now you do.
So what's creating this drag in China? And can Starbucks turn things around? Despite volatility in recent years, Starbucks is a historically strong brand that helped shape modern-day coffee culture across the world.
Going out for a cappuccino or a latte was not as much of a thing in the US prior to the 1990s, so Starbucks defined that. In China, they also sort of defined the culture, except coffee itself was not widely drank at all in China prior to when Starbucks entered 25 years ago.
Starbucks grew its presence in China relatively unchallenged until 2017. That's when its biggest competitor, Luckin, entered the market. By the end of 2018, its valuation had surpassed $2 billion, and the domestic competitor already had about half the number of stores that Starbucks did.
What's always been interesting about Starbucks is that it hasn't had a natural domestic rival. There are a lot of other American brands that do, but Starbucks hasn't. So all of their competitors have been Costa from the UK or UCC from Japan.
But by 2020, it seemed that Luckin may not have become the threat that Starbucks initially feared. After news broke that the company fabricated over $300 million in sales, it shut down hundreds of stores and was delisted from the NASDAQ in 2020. Still, it emerged from bankruptcy in 2022 and restructured its financial position. From 2022 to 2024, Luckin more than doubled its store count. It now has roughly 6,000 more company-operated stores than Starbucks.
Wow, that's a lot of stores to have in a single country. Obviously, China is a very big country, but that seems like a lot, especially considering they were just referencing how Starbucks basically said they could just keep growing infinitely, and they were just adding store after store after store. This seems like a lot. This is practically double.
It's no-bones, pared-down coffee shop that allows them to expand fast at a much lower price point. If the taste difference is not differentiating enough, this is dangerous for Starbucks. And Luckin has proved just as.
Also, I feel like we've seen some things recently about, and I have seen it personally, where like Starbucks seems to be really pushing their like sweet beverages and some of their like cold beverages in particular. And so this just might be something that isn't on trend in China, for instance. I don't believe as many other countries ingest as much sugar as we do in America. And so I could actually see how some of, like even for myself, when I see some of Starbucks' latest coffees and drinks, it's somewhat off-putting with like all the syrups and other stuff that they put in there. And so I could imagine for a culture that maybe has a fraction of our sugar intake that like they would lean more towards maybe a more classic type of coffee or something that's toned down a little bit.
Starbucks did in its first days really good at marketing itself.
Luckin's done a really good job of putting their locations in a ton of different places, growing location numbers dramatically. A lot of these are very small locations, so they're very easy to set up. You can put them in places like universities and schools and hospitals, and people can just go and get a cup of coffee very quickly.
That does seem like a good point, but I'm not sure. I guess maybe they can show one of these places, but there's other coffee shops in America that are small enough that they are at stores or hospitals or offices or anything like that, including Starbucks. I have seen them in smaller footprints in other buildings in the past, and presumably that would mean Starbucks wouldn't be able to compete in America against somebody else who is doing something of that sort. So I'm not sure if that's a good enough reason, but maybe they'll expand and add some more.
Whereas the Starbucks experience is more of an in-store experience.
Luckin utilizes a grab-and-go model. The only way customers can order is through a mobile app. The company was at the forefront of the now standard catering model when it first opened in China. Take a look at Starbucks app traffic compared to Luckin. Starbucks saw a spike in 2021, but more recently, it has lagged behind Luckin. Historically, Starbucks has distinguished itself through premiumization. That was especially true in China, when it went virtually unrivaled for many years and consumer confidence was strong. That changed after the pandemic.
Over the last few years, starting really in 21, 22, you really saw a step up in the amount of competitive activity as well in China. And I want to say it was around 2022, 2023, when you really start to see the rise of value, really utilized within a competitive set.
The Chinese consumer has been under a lot of economic pressure in recent years. Consumer spending is down. That means
I'm sure people outside of China would say that it feels like a recession. I feel like this is something that I see pretty regularly about the US. And as far as I can tell globally, US is actually not doing that poorly compared to some other countries. And so I can imagine this is a very true statement for so many people around the globe right now. So definitely having a better price point is definitely going to make you stand out in times where money is tight.
discretionary purchases, like a coffee, are the first to go.
As our survey indicated that when we asked consumers where we be cutting back to save money, dining out of restaurants was ranked number one.
Coffee consumers in China tend to be in their teens, 20s, and 30s. That's the largest and fastest growing market. But this is ones that have been hit the greatest by the economic slowdown, beginning with zero COVID, and the lack of rebound of the Chinese economy ever since. The collapse of the real estate market, in which people, including their own parents, who have invested a lot in real estate, suddenly feel 20, 30, 40% poorer than they were before.
That's why Luckin Coffee's biggest edge against Starbucks.
So I definitely agree with the price point. I think there's so many alternatives that are better options for price than Starbucks, especially for the quality nowadays. But again, I'm just going to make a note of it because I feel like it also just came up subtly in the background here, which is we're sort of seeing them reference this Luckin brand, and it seems like they're having like a standard cappuccino or latte or something like that here. And the couple instances where we saw a Starbucks cup, it looked like a milkshake or something like that. And so again, I think this is something that personally stands out to me, and I would assume would stand out for other people who are across other countries, where I can't imagine you would go to like Italy and people are just having a bunch of milkshakes from Starbucks instead of what they perceive as coffee, or Paris or anything like that. So again, I feel like this must be a similar phenomenon for China, where they must have a particular expectation of a coffee brand and what they would get at that store. And I feel like Starbucks is leaning away from it. With that said, that's my understanding of their market and product roadmap for the US. So they might not be doing as similarly in China. But again, a couple of those clips seem to really hammer that home for me. But I 100% agree with this price point segment, which is Starbucks is not cheap. People are going to look for cheaper alternatives if they're available.
Is price. While the sticker price of a latte at both companies is actually relatively similar, Luckin is known for consistently offering steep discounts. Starbucks, which rarely offers coupons, has been forced into it.
That's interesting. So again, they've sort of mentioned that the default pricing is the same. So maybe the discounting portion is here where the default price is the same, but then maybe you're just used to more discounts. I think Starbucks probably does the same thing when you use the app. I know other fast food brands and companies do something similar. So maybe this is how Luckin is beating them, is there's the standard price that everyone knows is supposed to be it, but nobody actually pays it, depending on how generous they are with these coupons.
Is seeing a lot of promotions right now because consumers are still under pressure. So you're seeing kind of a drag from that. In some cases, you're seeing companies that sort of have traffic growth, but check declines because of the level of promotions.
Other notable competitors include Kati Coffee and Manor, whose drinks typically run at least half the price of Starbucks.
You've got competitors that are growing very quickly. You've got the fact as well that coffee by nature is a high margin business. And so competitors can afford to provide discounts, just given there's a high customer lifetime value.
Over the past 2 years, Starbucks has been growing its number of customers in China, but people are spending less at its stores. And there's more to the story than just competition. Chinese nationalism has grown as political tensions remain high between the US and China.
Yes, this is kind of what I was referencing earlier, which is generally it's hard, I feel like, for any brand to enter into China. There's just a different culture there. They have different policies. How they go about things is different. It'd be like in America, how we have those like made in America stamps and certifications and things like that. And I'm sure it sways some people in America, but it's clearly not a ubiquitous thing. Whereas in China, there's a lot more actual predominant usage of things that are made in China, companies, products, whatever it is. And so for there is a lot of like this nationalism through capitalism that exists, whereas we don't have that in America. We're much more pure capitalism. Whatever's the cheapest thing is what we're going to get. And so we don't seem to kind of put our money behind some of these nationalist brands and products as much as they do in China.
The effects trickle down to even coffee consumption.
It really starts as a luxury product. At the same time, it's subject in a moment of international tension to what you might think of as brand nationalism. It's not that people are anti-Starbucks or anti-American in not buying Starbucks, but you might be more tempted, or at least you're taking somebody out for a date. Don't take this woman to show off that you're well off by taking her to a fancy coffee place. Take her to a patriotic, 中国特色的 coffee, a special coffee with Chinese characteristics.
While competition in the country is far more elevated than a decade ago, there's still a lot of space for Starbucks to grow. China's population is more than 4 times that of the US. Plus, out-of-home coffee as a concept is still relatively new there, and Starbucks differentiates itself as a sit-down option, while a lot of competitors are grab and go.
In the spring, we ran a survey of 2,000 consumers in China, and the survey told us that while 80% of consumers and respondents identified as coffee drinkers, only 18% drink coffee on a daily basis, signaling that Starbucks is in early innings in what was historically a tea-drinking nation. Interestingly, when we asked about brand perception, Starbucks ranked highest on taste profile and ranked second on value, second to the category leader Luckin in the market.
In December 2024, Starbucks hired a chief growth officer to help steer the company back on course in China. Experts say there is opportunity to optimize the brand's offering beyond just cost considerations.
I don't think competing on prices is really the answer there. One of the things they might look into is localization efforts. Other players like KFC and Burger King have done a bit of this, where they partner with local players, focus on that premium growth, but with a bit more of a local eye. Luckin's been doing a whole lot with different flavors, and they explore lots of different flavors on a month-to-month basis.
Another way that Luckin has been able to expand so quickly is by franchising its establishments. It has around 13,400 company-owned stores and 7,400 partnership stores. It collects royalties from these independently run partnership stores. Starbucks operates that same type of mixed model in the US. It licenses operators to run stores that are typically found inside Targets or airports where real estate would otherwise be inaccessible. In China, all of Starbucks' establishments are currently company operated.
It's a matter of when, not if, that you see the China ownership structure shift into something more asset light, for instance, via a licensee or a joint venture. Typically what you see in international markets is that it's an all or nothing. And I think that with China, it would make sense to make it 100% licensed or franchised rather than splitting that up.
It creates a little bit less earnings volatility. I think it creates a little bit less operational risk. It can reduce brand risk if you have sort of a local owner operator, even though you're still a Western brand, right? You have a local owner operator. And so I think in today's political environment, that probably makes more sense.
In its latest earnings call, Starbucks said it was continuing to, quote, explore strategic partnerships. That essentially means it's still considering licensing as an option, but it remains to be seen how it's ultimately going to move forward. The company declined an interview with CNBC for this story.
While Starbucks still has plenty of white space in China, the key debate for investors is who is ripe to build that. Is it the company, as this remains status quo, that Starbucks will continue to own China and bank on an ultimate recovery? Or will the company find a local partner who will help build the stores and license the stores and pay Starbucks a royalty instead?
Thank you for watching. If you've enjoyed what you've seen, please hit like or subscribe. I'll see you around.